Hello and welcome to Macroeconomics Module 7, Lecture 5. Today we're going to be talking about what economists call expectations, what normal people say are predictions. So when I say expectations, if you want to put the word predictions into your mind, that would be fine. But I want to get you used to hearing how economists talk about it. And the Phillips curve, another diagram. Here's the good news. This diagram is the last new diagram you're going to have to learn. Not saying we won't be using the diagrams we have till the end of the course, we will. But once we get the aggregate supply and aggregate demand diagram down and understand the Phillips curve, there are no new diagrams that you're going to have to learn for macroeconomics. It's just getting more and more used to dealing with the diagrams that you know. And we're going to create the Phillips curve because it's an easier diagram to work with when you want to talk about expectations or predictions compared to the aggregate supply aggregate demand diagram. And why are we talking about expectations or predictions? Because they play a huge role in determining how long it takes us to get to the long run. And knowing how long it takes us to get to the long run is going to be pretty darn important. We've seen, because of the various legs, that it might take a year and a half from the start of a recession for Keynesian expansionary fiscal policy to do much. Well, if a recession is going to last for 3 years because we're stuck in the short run for 3 years, then you still want to do it. But what if the recession is going to be over in a year and a half, right? And when you get to the long run, the recession is over. What if you get to the long run in a year and a half? Then, just as the expansionary fiscal policy starts moving the aggregate demand curve to the right, the natural adjustment of wages and shifting of the short-run aggregate supply curve has got you back to Q sub n, and then this move to the right of aggregate demand is going to throw you into the inflationary gap. You can think of it as a doctor. He has a medicine that has bad side effects and takes 2 weeks to work for a disease. If the disease is going to be over before 2 weeks have passed, he should not give you the medicine. If the disease is going to last 6 months, he should give you the medicine. So how long we stay in a recession, which we can re-ask in our model as how long does it take us to get to the long run, plays a huge part in determining if we should even try to do Keynesian policy or not. All right, so what we're going to develop here first is our Phillips curve diagram. And the Phillips curve shows the trade-off between inflation and unemployment. You put unemployment on the horizontal axis, and you put inflation on the vertical axis, and inflation commonly is measured by either CPI or GDP deflator. This diagram that I stole from a book called it the implicit price deflator, but that's the GDP deflator. And for a year, you put the ordered pair of unemployment and inflation for that year. And you see for the years 1961 and 1969, what a beautiful, perfect slanted C curve they make. And they are showing this nice, steady relationship that as inflation gets higher, unemployment gets lower. And almost every point is exactly on the curve of the 1960s, the Phillips curve from 1961 to 1969. And this representation of the idea that as inflation gets higher, unemployment goes down, should not actually surprise us. It should be what we expect. So here we see a Phillips curve on the right, not from actual data like the previous one, but a made up one. But you see on the left we have aggregate demand and aggregate supply. And assume we're starting here at AD1, which is the aggregate demand curve to the far left. What you notice is if the government moves aggregate demand to the right, Or it could be anything that's moving aggregate demand to the right. But if we think of it as expansionary fiscal policy moving aggregate demand to the right, and the more of the expansionary fiscal policy the government does, the bigger the deficit they run, the more aggregate demand moves to the right. So if they do a little, we go to 82. If they do a medium amount, we go to 83. If they do a lot, we go to 84, which is the far right. If you can't see the numbers because they're pretty darn small, the one on the far left is 81, and then the next one over is 82, 83. So the more expansionary fiscal policy the government does, the more they move aggregate demand to the right. You see two things happening. Number one, the more there is an increase in production. And the other thing that's happening is the more there is an increase in price. In other words, the greater the move in aggregate demand, the greater the increase in output, and the greater the inflation. Now, in our Phillips curve, we don't have output, we have unemployment. So what we're going to use is that rule that when output goes up, unemployment goes down. So we see the more that the government moves aggregate demand to the right, the lower unemployment is getting, but also the higher inflation is getting. And that's what the Phillips curve is showing here, and that's what the Phillips curve was showing on the previous slide, which is the actual data from the 1960s. So the Phillips curve was showing a relationship that many Keynesian economists in the 1960s were thinking is this Phillips curve for the U.S. exists, and we can basically go wherever we want to go on it by just running as big a deficit as it takes to move aggregate demand enough to the right to get unemployment down that low. So the Phillips curve is really closely related to the aggregate demand, aggregate supply curve. It's just simpler. For one thing, it only has one line rather than intersecting lines. And for another thing, you can plot 3, 4, 8 years as just points without having to actually have points of intersection. So it's simpler than the aggregate demand, aggregate supply curve, which means sometimes you can't use it. But for discussing the effect of expectations on unemployment and inflation, it's great. Now, in the long run, this nice, smooth, slanted C, stable, slanted C Phillips curve has not held. And why has it not held? And the short answer is changes in expectations, changes in how people were predicting the future. There is a professional association of economists in the United States called the American Economics Association. And every year they elect a president, and to be elected president is a great honor. It's a recognition by your peers that you're one of the great economists of the country. And one of the perks is you get to give a speech on economics that basically the whole profession will be aware of. In 1969, which is the last year that Phillips curve of the 60s was looking so stable, the elected president was Milton Friedman, who we'll talk about more when we talk about monetary economics. Milton Friedman chose as his subject in his address to the AEA that the Phillips curve that so many macroeconomists of the 1960s thought was such a stable thing you could build the economy around was about to go all to hell. He didn't use that word, that wasn't his phrasing, but it's the accurate paraphrasing. And he based his explanation of why that Phillips curve of the 1960s was about to fall apart on the topic of expectations and answering the question, how stupid are people anyway? And here is Friedman's explanation of the Phillips curve relationship of the higher inflation goes, the lower unemployment goes. And you'll like this explanation because we don't have to use the aggregate supply, aggregate demand diagram to get it. Friedman says, let's say the government causes 3% inflation, and they could do that by either doing expansionary fiscal policy, though Friedman would not say that because he's actually was the leading anti-Keynesian of the time because he was a very strong believer in crowding out. So when he talks about the government creating inflation, he is, in his mind, always talking about them printing up money. So, to be true to Friedman, we'll talk about it in terms of printing up money too. So let's say that the government causes 3% inflation by printing up 3% more money. Would that actually happen? When we get to monetary economics, we'll talk a lot about that question. But for now, we'll just take it as a given that if the government prints up 3% more money, prices will rise by 3%. In the simple version of Friedman's story, that's basically what he's using. Now, we're in the short run, so the workers have a fixed wage. So from the viewpoint of the business, they've been able to raise the price of their product 3%, but they don't have to pay their workers any more money. So the workers have just gotten cheaper. It's like you didn't change the price of your product, but you were able to pay your workers 3% less. And as the workers get cheaper relative to the sales price of the product, the business owner will hire more of them. His profits will have expanded. He will increase production. So you can either think of it as profits have gone up, so he wants to make more of his product, so he hires more workers, or workers have gotten cheaper compared to the price of the product and he hires more workers. You get the same answer either way. So the Keynesians of the 60s were talking about this like, so you'll just permanently year after year have lower unemployment. But Friedman says, how long can this go on? Because we're living in a world where every year the price of products is going up 3% and the workers are getting no raises. So they're getting a 3% cut in their real wage. Won't the workers, won't the people of this country eventually catch on and start to expect 3% inflation and start to demand 3% cost of living raises, which in their mind, and correctly so, are not raises at all, just what they need to keep at the same real income, to protect them against inflation, to keep them from being poor. And because unemployment is low and the workers have a negotiating advantage, they should be able to get these 3% cost of living raises. They should be able to say to the boss who doesn't give it to them, well, the guy across the street is, I'm going to go work for him. And the other thing is the bosses, while they may not admit it, they agree with the workers that for 5 years we've had 3% inflation. Next year I expect there will be 3% inflation, so I'll be able to raise the price of my product 3%. So will I be able to afford to pay the worker 3% more? Yeah, I don't like it. I preferred the world where I got 3% more for my product and the workers didn't get any more. But in the back of my mind, I know I can afford it. And it seems necessary to not start losing my workers. So yeah, I start to give my workers 3% raises. So now what's happening as the government prints up 3% more money is that prices are going up 3% a year, but workers' wages are going up 3% a year. So we ask the question, in this world, how much cheaper are workers getting compared to the price of the product? And the answer is none. None more cheaper. So when we ask, so how many extra workers are hired because they are cheaper? The answer is none. None more extra workers. Don't tell any of your English teachers I just said that, but I think you understand. So what does this look like on the Phillips curve when the government is creating 3% inflation, but now people expect 3% inflation? Well, we just saw that people are getting their 3% cost of living allowance raise, and a cost of living allowance raise is what I will call it when workers are getting a raise that both them and the workers don't think of as really a raise. It's just supposed to protect them against inflation so they're not getting poor. So we just saw that the answer to how many more workers are hired because workers are getting cheaper is none. Now, when I say how many more or how many additional workers compared to what? Compared to the natural rate of unemployment or U sub n. So on this Phillips curve, I have marked the natural rate of unemployment at 6%. We talked a little bit about what the natural rate is back in the unemployment chapter. Nowadays, we consider in this economy, at least up until the COVID problem, but assuming the COVID problem goes away and we get back to the way things were, probably the conventional wisdom would say that the natural rate of unemployment is 5%. But back in the 70s, when Friedman is talking, and in the 80s, when I was taking macroeconomics at Cypress Community College, the belief was, and it's not that it's a wrong belief, it's just for whatever reason for their economy back then, the national rate was closer to 6%. And so, since workers are not getting any cheaper compared to the price of the product, and since businesses that are not hiring any additional workers above and beyond what they would normally or naturally hire, the unemployment rate will be at the natural rate of unemployment. U sub n, 6%, marked by the blue star with the red outline. So you see what's happening here is when people are expecting no percent inflation, or actually on this Phillips curve, I can tell they're expecting about 1%, and I'll tell you how you know that next lecture, that at first when they're getting 3% inflation, because prices are going up faster than workers' wages, so workers are getting cheaper, bosses are hiring extra workers, and unemployment's going down below U sub n, going down below 6%, all the way down to 4% at about 3% inflation. But once the workers catch on that this is what's going to happen and start giving 3% raises to go along with the 3% increase in prices, then businesses won't hire any more workers than normal, and the overall natural rate of unemployment will be equal to the natural rate. So we will go from the point where we are being at where 1966 and 1967 to where that star is. And so let's conclude this lecture by doubling back on Friedman's point in 1969, predicting that what looked like that stable slanted C Phillips curve was about to go all to hell. He was predicting, because of these changes in people's expectations of inflation, the Phillips curves would start to move all over the place. Here are the points from 1961 to 2011. And what looked like a nice, stable, slanted C relationship in the 1960s, as you see, fell apart. It's not easy to see a nice, smooth relationship, a nice, smooth line that would connect all of these points. And it's not only because people's predictions of inflation were changing as we went through time, but that's a huge part of why the Phillips curves were shifting, and thus why points on the various Phillips curves look like just a mishmash of things. Well, okay, we're almost to our 18-minute mark, our 18-minute limit, so I'm going to stop here in part one of our discussion of expectations and the Phillips curve, and we'll pick up in lecture 6. So I'll see you there. Till then, take care.